Greetings from Waco, Texas. My name is Paul Martens, and I'm an associate professor of ethics at Baylor University. As part of my responsibilities, I get to teach undergraduate and graduate students courses concerned with ethics, environmental ethics, religious ethics, war and nonviolence, and global ethics. And it's in this last field, global ethics, that my most recent research has been located, particularly in questions of human dignity and interreligious cooperation. And so it's also against this background that I offer the following comments on living with gratitude in the global context. Now, to contextualize my comments as well, I should note that it's Thanksgiving weekend in North America. This is the busiest travel weekend of the year, and it's a weekend when families and friends gather from near and far to share meals together and to give thanks for what they've been given. And even as a kid growing up in Canada, this is a holiday that we celebrated, even though we totally understood it was primarily an American narrative that made this make sense. And where exactly does this holiday come from? I guess I should say something about that. Well, sometime in the early 1600s, pilgrims arrived in America from England on the Mayflower. The pilgrims landed at Plymouth Rock, seeking a place to practice their religion freely, a place where they could build a new society that would become a beacon of light for all the world to see. That's how the narrative goes. So upon their arrival, a tribe of indigenous Americans welcomed the grateful pilgrims and shared a meal with them, a meal that we still kind of nostalgically evoke by serving turkey, a meal that is now celebrated as Thanksgiving. Now, I want to say up front that I believe it's incredibly important to give thanks, or maybe even better, it's incredibly important that we learn to live in gratitude. It's a kind of lifelong disposition that I'm trying to cultivate and no doubt failing miserably fairly frequently. Yet, like the founding myths of this holiday we call Thanksgiving, it's a complex disposition, especially in places like North America in the developed world, where so much of what one is tempted to give thanks for is built on the consumption or destruction of others, or the consumption and destruction of the world around us. Now, please allow me to explain this by looking back at the Thanksgiving myth itself, and that'll help illuminate what I'm trying to get at. If we look at the reality between the Europeans and the indigenous Americans, we have to recognize that the encounter is not really equal for both parties, actually not even close to equal. Beginning over a century before the arrival of the Mayflower, the colonial appetite for land and resources, along with the imported diseases, had already left a trail of violence and destruction across the eastern seaboard of North America. So to the extent that they violently cleared away the native inhabitants, the European colonies prospered and expanded as if it was their manifest destiny, and they even began to talk in these same terms. And it is precisely this prosperity and expansion that mythically grounds our Thanksgiving holidays today. Now, stepping back, this should be and ought to be deeply troubling, because giving thanks for something achieved through unjust harm or violence is just wrong, morally wrong, and profoundly selfish. It enshrines injustice as something good and worthy of celebrating. So now, of course, my point here is not simply the academic issue that the story of how Thanksgiving came to be is problematic, which it is. But my point is to push it forward to our contemporary context. And by that, I mean, I want to kind of suggest that we are often blinded in our celebration of everyday injustice and harm, just like we are to the American exceptionalism at the heart of celebrating Thanksgiving. Now, again, to be sure, there is much one ought to be thankful for. The beauty of the natural world, the love of a friend or partner, the devotion of a son or daughter, one's health, especially this year in 2020. These are gifts that one cannot acquire by force. And these are gifts that one does not control. These are gifts received from a source outside oneself. And so receiving them properly is an exercise in humility and wonder, as it ought to be. But here in the more economically developed world, we all too often confuse these sorts of gifts with other things that are only achieved through injustice and harm, or at least injustice and harm are woven into their reception. For example, from the factory farm turkeys that are eaten for Thanksgiving dinner to the table itself made from wood acquired through forest clear cutting, from the beer cans made out of bauxite strip mined in India to the conflict minerals from Congo in the cell phones that distract us from the usual dramas of family gatherings, from the clothes sewn by Uyghurs forced into Chinese re-education camps to the plastic containers made of Venezuelan oil that hold the leftovers. The list could go on. Economic, environmental, and human exploitation are simply just woven into the everyday standard of living for which we all too casually give thanks. And this is, to my mind, one of the uncomfortable secrets of the developed world, and celebrating it with thanks does little except further normalize these practices. To be sure, it's not that we are all monsters meaning to cause global harm. Absolutely none of my friends and family could be described that way. Rather, I suggest that it's because our lives are so compartmentalized. It is nearly impossible to see the connections between the things we use, the processes by which they're acquired, and the people involved in their extraction and production. And if the harm can be hidden from view, then consumption is determined primarily by aesthetic or budgetary means, rather than moral grounds. So, might I make a request of my fellow North Americans this Thanksgiving? Instead of giving thanks for the comforts of our everyday existence, let's make a commitment to being the source of someone else's reason for giving thanks next year at this time. To that end, I challenge you to pick up two things present in our everyday life and commit to addressing or redressing the injustices and harms that are implicit in its existence. Now, what I mean by that is pick any two things. It could be a pair of pants, shoes, shirt, vehicle, building, desk, bicycle, any two things. Spend some time figuring out the constituent parts of those two things, the source of these parts, the processes of production, the human and environmental expenditures needed to extract, produce, and assemble the constituent parts, and to ship them. If possible, get to know and listen to people in the parts of the world where these things come from, their desires, their dreams, what they're thankful for, what they think of their work. And to those of you seeing this in the Global South, might I ask the following. Please do not hesitate to get in touch with me if you are willing to help illuminate the breadth and depth of these systemic challenges from your part of the world. Yes, we have all kinds of troubles internal to North America, and Black Lives Matter has made that explicit in all kinds of ways this past year. But the international imbalance is even greater, and I want to hear about that as much as possible. Only when we have a clear view of the dehumanizing and ecologically destructive entailments of our everyday existence can we begin to make the necessary personal and systemic changes. And these changes will not be accomplished easily or quickly. I'm not a dummy, and neither are you. And as a wise friend of mine once said, you can only chew one mouthful at a time. In truth, we are embedded in a network of international imbalances with a long history. But we need to remember that it is merely a human history, a history of human decisions, which are subject to revision and restructuring. And we are not lone individuals. We belong to families. We live in neighborhoods. We have groups of friends. We have coworkers, and we belong to religious groups. And many of these groups extend well beyond international borders. Together, we can learn to become the difference for which others can be thankful. So, as we give thanks this weekend, and we ought to still give thanks this weekend, let's also take stock of the things for which we ought to feel regret or distress. And rather than throw up our hands in resignation, which we're always tempted to do, let's take one small step forward and see where it takes us. Every journey, great or small, begins in the same way. But now is the time to take that step together, because Christmas raises this challenge to a whole new level, and it's just around the corner. Thank you.